They're everywhere, smiling at you, pretending to support you, praising your every move. But beneath that charm is a dagger, carefully hidden, waiting to strike the moment you become too trusting. And you've felt it, haven't you? That sting in your chest when someone you opened up to twists your words. That slow burning regret after realizing their kindness was just a tactic. How many times have you second-guessed yourself just because someone made you feel small behind a friendly face? How many times have you stayed silent to keep the peace while your own boundaries were being trampled? The truth is, most manipulation doesn't feel like betrayal. It feels like confusion, like self-doubt. But Stoic philosophy warns us, if you don't define your values, someone else will define your worth. This isn't just about spotting manipulators. This is about reclaiming your mind before it's rewired by their games. Because the battle isn't out there, it's in how you respond. And once you master that, no one can control you without your permission. If that kind of clarity speaks to something inside you, subscribe as a choice to think sharper, live truer, and walk the Stoic path with intention. 1. Pretend you don't see it at first. Most people think that the best way to deal with manipulation is to fight it head-on, to expose it the moment it shows up. But what if that's exactly what the manipulator wants? What if your reaction is the hook? The truth is, manipulators thrive on visibility. They want to see what gets to you. They want to measure your emotional temperature, your weakness, your need for validation. So the most powerful thing you can do at the beginning is nothing. Not out of fear, but out of calm calculation. You see, pretending you don't notice isn't ignorance, it's strategy. It's a conscious choice to gather information while giving nothing away. The way someone talks when they think you're not paying attention says far more than when they're performing. That's when the mask slips. That's when the patterns show. The Stoics believed that our greatest strength lies in mastering what we choose to give our energy to. Not every battle is worth fighting. Not every storm needs your anchor. You can see the manipulation clearly and still decide not to engage. Because when you withhold your reaction, you keep your power. And when you keep your power, they can't get inside your mind. There's a strange silence that comes with watching someone try to manipulate you and fail. You let them tell their little half-truths. You let them spin their stories. You let them smile a bit too wide, act a bit too friendly. But inside, you're calm. You're just watching. When someone believes they've got you fooled, that's when they get sloppy. They talk more. They expose themselves. They start believing in their own performance. And you're a mirror. You reflect nothing back. That silence you hold. It's louder than any accusation. Because true control doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from being unshaken. Carl Jung once said, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." That irritation you feel when someone tries to play you, it's not a signal to explode. It's a signal to observe. Because the more you understand the tactics, the less you'll fall for them. You don't need to fix them. You don't need to teach them a lesson. You just need to watch until they show you who they are without even realizing it. Holding your reaction is not weakness, it's discipline. And discipline, in a world full of noise, is rare. It's not about being passive. It's about being still until movement has value. And you'll know when that moment comes. The energy in the room will shift. Their confidence will crack. Their words will stretch too far. And that's when you'll see it. The desperation underneath the performance. The need to be believed, to be validated. That's the root of manipulation. A hunger to control how others see them. But you're not giving them that power. You're not playing the role they wrote for you. You're choosing presence over panic, patience over pride. That's what Stoicism teaches. Respond with your principles, not your impulses. Most people lose the game before it even begins because they show too much, too soon. They get emotionally involved, they argue, they try to prove they're right. But manipulators don't play fair. They don't care about truth. They care about control. And every time you react, you hand them more rope to pull on. That's why strategic ignorance isn't about pretending to be dumb. It's about being smart enough not to be baited. Think about how many arguments you could have avoided if you just let silence do the talking. How many people showed you who they were when you stopped explaining yourself to them? There's a kind of peace in not needing to be understood by someone who's committed to misunderstanding you. You don't need to expose them right away. You don't need to fix the story. You just need to stay centered. It's hard though, isn't it? When you see someone spreading lies or subtly digging into your character, your instinct screams to fight back, to clear your name, to shout your truth. But here's the catch. The moment you start defending yourself to someone who already decided their version of you, you've already lost your footing. You're playing their game. You're fighting in their arena. And that's not where your strength is. Your strength is in your ability to be unmoved, to live in a way that's so rooted in truth that the lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Seneca wrote, "A gem cannot be polished without friction, nor a man perfected without trials." These moments, when someone tries to twist your image, are the friction, not to destroy you, but to reveal what kind of stone you really are. There's nothing louder than the silence of someone who sees through you and says nothing. It's unsettling. Manipulators hate unpredictability. They want you loud, emotional, defensive. That way, they can twist your reaction into proof of your guilt. But when you stay calm, when you let their words float unanswered, you take away their momentum. People start to wonder why you're so composed. They start to notice how much effort the other person is putting into spinning things. And slowly, without you doing anything, the story shifts. Not because you argued better, but because you refuse to react. That's not passivity, that's control. You learn a lot about people when you stop talking, when you stop correcting them, when you stop trying to be liked. That's when people get comfortable enough to reveal their true selves. It's a strange gift, really, watching a person unfold. The jokes they make, the way they speak about others, the inconsistencies in their stories. When you're not busy trying to win their approval, you can finally see what's actually in front of you. And sometimes what's in front of you is someone playing a very careful game. But it's okay. You don't need to call it out. Just take notes. And more importantly, don't forget how it made you feel. Your emotional response is a compass, not for reacting, but for guiding your boundaries moving forward. Not every manipulator is malicious. Some are just deeply insecure. Some don't even realize they're doing it. But that doesn't mean you should tolerate it. Stoicism isn't about letting people walk over you. It's about choosing your battles and protecting your peace. You're not ignoring to be nice. You're ignoring to stay aligned with your values. And when you live by values instead of emotions, you become incredibly hard to manipulate, because nothing they do can shake what you've already built inside. It's not always about outsmarting them. Sometimes it's just about not playing the game at all. The most dangerous person in the room is the one who doesn't need to prove anything, the one who isn't easily flattered, who doesn't react to jabs, who sees through the masks, but never rushes to rip them off, because they know something deeper. They know that time exposes everything, that pressure reveals intention, and that silence is often the only response needed to dismantle a performance. So the next time someone tries to bait you with sweet words and sharp edges, pause. Don't react, don't explain, don't feed the fire. Just notice, feel, watch. And in that stillness, let them show you everything you need to know. Because once you've seen it clearly, you'll never unsee it again. And that clarity, that's the beginning of freedom, not just from them, but from the part of you that used to need their approval. You are not here to dance for someone else's comfort. You are here to live in truth, in presence, and in peace. And sometimes the only way to protect that peace is to pretend you don't see the chaos until you're ready to walk away from it completely. 2. Let their words echo into silence. There's a strange discomfort that fills the room when you don't react the way someone expects you to, especially a manipulator. They speak with a certain rhythm, a certain cadence, designed to pull you in. They know which words to use to poke at your insecurities, to trigger a sense of guilt or urgency. But what they don't expect, what unnerves them more than any argument, is your silence. That pause, that stillness. Because silence doesn't confirm anything, it doesn't agree, it doesn't resist, it just exists. And in that space, they begin to squirm. You see, manipulators are artists of control. Their brush is your reaction, their canvas is your face, and when you give them nothing to paint on, they're left standing there, holding their tools with nowhere to go. We've been trained to believe that staying silent means we're weak, that we're losing, that we've got nothing to say. But the truth is, silence is the strongest response when used intentionally. It's not the absence of power, it's the concentration of it. When someone throws a passive-aggressive comment your way or questions your motives with a smile, the temptation to fire back is strong, to defend, explain, clarify. But every time you do, you open the door for them to shape the narrative. They pull you into their rhythm, and the longer you stay there, the more they spin. But silence, that's your reset button. It's how you step out of their storm and stand in your own calm. Carl Jung once wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." When you're in tune with your inner world, your emotions, your reactions, your triggers, you no longer feel the need to react to every comment. You realize most provocations are projections. Most accusations are just confessions in disguise. So when you choose silence, you're not ignoring, you're observing. You're choosing not to carry the weight of someone else's emotional chaos. And in doing so, you give yourself space to respond, not out of impulse, but from clarity. Manipulators hate empty space. They hate the sound of their own words bouncing back at them with no resistance. It's like watching a puppet show with no audience. Suddenly, the act falls flat. The illusion shatters, because they weren't really speaking to you, they were speaking for your reaction. And when it doesn't come, their power slips. Silence makes them question their script. Did it land? Did you notice? Are you playing dumb or playing smart? That confusion is unsettling. It forces them to confront the emptiness behind their tactics. And in that uncertainty, you hold the upper hand without lifting a finger. But silence isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about choosing what's worth your energy. It's about understanding that not everything needs a response. Some things are better left unanswered because they say more about the speaker than they ever could about you. When someone insults you, for example, and you respond with anger, they get confirmation. They know they got under your skin. But if you just look at them, steady and still, the power shifts. The insult floats in the air and lands nowhere. It loses its force because its target didn't catch it. And without your emotional reaction, it becomes meaningless. We often forget that silence isn't just a response, it's a boundary. It says, "I heard you. I just choose not to engage." It's a way of refusing the invitation to chaos, of saying, "I won't be pulled into your world just because you're uncomfortable in mine." That's a Stoic move, not to suppress emotion but to direct it, to channel it where it matters. And sometimes that means saying absolutely nothing, not out of fear, but out of mastery. Think about the last time you got into an argument you regretted. Chances are it started with something small, a little jab, a sarcastic comment, a guilt trip. And before you knew it, you were deep in it, explaining yourself, raising your voice, defending your intentions. But what if you had paused? What if instead of firing back, you had simply let their words echo and fall silent? That single choice could have changed everything, not just for the moment, but for the relationship itself. Because when someone realizes they can't pull you into emotional warfare, they either stop trying or they reveal just how much their behavior depends on your reaction. Silence also creates space for truth to surface, for perspective to sharpen. It gives you time to notice the patterns, the way they always bring things up when you're vulnerable, the way they twist your words when others are around. These things become clear only when you're not too busy reacting, only when you're not lost in defending your image. When you're still, you see more, you hear more, and what you discover may be what finally sets you free. But let's be honest, silence isn't easy. It's tempting to want to correct the narrative, to want to make sure people see your side, especially when your character is being challenged. But that desire, that need to explain, often comes from fear. Fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing control, fear of looking weak. But what if your stillness was the very thing that made you strong? What if not reacting was the exact opposite of weakness? It was wisdom. The most grounded people you meet are rarely the loudest. They're the ones who observe more than they speak, who don't rush to prove themselves, who don't need to explain their every decision. And that's what makes them so hard to read, so hard to control. Manipulators rely on predictability, but silence disrupts the pattern. It makes them unsure. And that uncertainty is powerful. It places the pressure back where it belongs, on them. So when the moment comes, and it will, when someone tries to bait you into a reaction, take a breath. Hold the line. Let their words hang in the air. Let the silence do what your voice doesn't need to. Because that choice, that tiny, quiet act of self-control, is a form of power few people will ever understand. And it might just be the moment you stop being their puppet and start being your own anchor. 3. Own the narrative. There's something deeply unsettling about being misrepresented. Someone takes a piece of what you said, stretches it, bends it, and suddenly you're defending yourself against a version of you that doesn't even exist. It doesn't take much. Just a few misplaced words, a couple of raised eyebrows, and now you're caught in a storm you didn't create. And instinctively, we want to clear it up. We want to explain, justify, correct. But here's the thing, the more you chase after someone else's version of your story, the further you drift from your own. Because defending isn't the same as leading. If you don't claim the pen, someone else will write your character, and they rarely write it kindly. In this world, people believe what they feel faster than what they hear. If the perception is strong enough, facts don't matter. And that's where many people get trapped. They try to fight lies with facts. But perception doesn't run on facts. It runs on energy, tone, presence. That's why it's not enough to just react to the distortion. You have to reshape the entire frame, not through force, through stillness, clarity, and consistency. You don't scream truth, you embody it. Because once you begin trying to convince people of your character, you've already given up control of the narrative. You've stepped into someone else's version of the story. The Stoics understood this deeply. Your integrity is something you live, not something you argue for. Owning the narrative doesn't mean becoming defensive or overly concerned with how everyone sees you. It means choosing the image you reflect through your actions and sticking to it regardless of who misreads it. That's how clarity is built. Slowly, silently, consistently. The more someone tries to twist who you are, the more powerful it is when you don't flinch. You keep doing the work. You stay on your path. You speak calmly, live cleanly, and let time do what noise never could. Reveal the truth. And the truth has a strange way of rising when you stop trying to force it. There's a kind of quiet authority in not needing to explain yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. It's hard, of course, especially when the lie is spreading faster than you can contain it, especially when the ones you thought were in your corner begin to hesitate. That feeling, that ache in your chest when your name is on someone else's tongue, it's a real thing. But reacting emotionally only adds fuel to the story they're trying to write. That's what a manipulator hopes for. They want your reaction to be the proof of your guilt. But when you stay calm, when you don't run to defend yourself every time someone misquotes you, it unsettles them. It makes people pause. Why isn't he reacting? Why is she so composed? That pause is where your strength lives, and in that pause people start to wonder whether the version they heard is really the truth. Your narrative is built through action, not explanation. People might hear rumors, but they remember patterns. If your life tells a consistent story, if your values show up in how you carry yourself, then that becomes your truth. And it sticks. Even when others try to rewrite it, the more grounded you are in your identity, the harder it becomes for others to shake it. Because at some point, people begin to trust what they see more than what they hear. And what they see is someone who doesn't need the approval of the crowd to stand tall in their truth. Sometimes, the smartest move isn't to confront the gossip, it's to overshadow it, to show up so consistently, so confidently, that any whisper of manipulation fades into background noise. The people who matter will pay attention to how you carry yourself under pressure, how you speak when you have every reason to explode, how you move when others try to pull you down. And that grace, that composure, it says more than any defense ever could. You don't prove your worth through arguments, you prove it through posture, through patience, through that unshakable belief that your truth doesn't need protection, it needs presence. Think about all the energy wasted chasing narratives, the sleepless nights spent wondering what they're saying, the emotional labor of clearing your name to people who weren't really listening in the first place. What if you used that energy to build something, to grow stronger, to get quieter, sharper, more focused? What if you let your results speak so loudly that every lie collapsed under its own emptiness? That's how you reclaim control. Not by wrestling with rumors, but by rising above them. That's the essence of owning the narrative. You don't just speak the truth, you live it in a way that can't be faked. There's also wisdom in understanding that not every false story needs a counter-narrative. Some things die without oxygen. Not all fires should be fought. Some should be left to burn themselves out. The more you run around correcting misperceptions, the more you feed them. But when you stop showing up to the battle, when you take the fuel away, the fire loses its power. And people notice that. They notice when you stop explaining and start embodying. They notice when you replace explanation with execution. When you choose dignity over defense. To own the narrative is to understand that your life is your voice. How you respond to misrepresentation is a direct reflection of your internal strength. When you're emotionally reactive, they own your image. But when you're composed, intentional, and calm, the power returns to you. That's what Stoicism teaches us. Not to be indifferent, but to be disciplined. Not to suppress, but to choose carefully what deserves your energy. Because at the end of the day, you don't control what people say. You control what you say, what you do, what you build. And the more you focus on building something real, the less time you'll have to worry about stories written by people who don't even know the full picture. That's the cost of staying true to yourself. Not everyone will get it. But that's okay. Because the ones who matter won't need to be convinced. They'll feel it. And when they do, the lies won't matter anymore. The story will belong to you. 4. Divide the circle without saying a word. Manipulators rarely work alone. They thrive in groups, alliances, unspoken circles of power and loyalty that operate just beneath the surface. Their strength doesn't come from being loud. It comes from the whispers, the shared glances, the carefully placed seeds of influence that make others question their own loyalties without even realizing it. It's not always the words that are dangerous. It's the tone, the implication, the silent cues. And once those circles are formed, they start to feed on each other. They reinforce the manipulator's game without needing to be told what to do. That's why confronting a manipulator directly often fails. They've already built their safety net. But even the strongest alliance becomes fragile when uncertainty creeps in. When one thread unravels, the whole web begins to loosen. There's no need to attack. You don't need to expose anyone. That only invites more resistance. The smarter path is to become the unseen disruptor. Slowly, without a word, shift the balance. Make them question what they thought was solid. Compliment one member of the group more than the others. Ask about their opinions privately. Give the impression that not everyone is getting the same version of you. Not because you're being dishonest, but because you're forcing them to think for themselves. And once that thinking starts, the silence inside their group gets loud. Jealousy is subtle. It doesn't need a spotlight. All it needs is a small imbalance, just enough to make someone wonder, why them and not me? These small moves don't create chaos on their own, but they allow the existing cracks to expand. Manipulators often build alliances on shallow foundations: flattery, fear, mutual enemies. When you inject a bit of tension, those foundations start to show. People begin to talk less, trust less, and eventually they begin to look out for themselves. That's when the manipulation loses its momentum, because no manipulator can thrive in a space where their own circle starts watching each other more closely than they watch you. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." In this context, it reminds us that being underestimated is powerful. When others are busy keeping up appearances, you're free to observe, to influence from a position of calm detachment. Insecure people always search for validation, and manipulators rely on that. They weaponize people's need to belong, to feel favored, to feel safe within a group. But if you introduce just a hint of doubt, if you withhold just a little of your approval from the group dynamic, it breaks the spell. People start to feel uneasy. They stop relying on each other the way they used to. The energy shifts. That silence between messages, that odd look across the room, that moment of hesitation when someone agrees too quickly, those tiny moments compound. Not because you said anything dramatic, but because you said less than usual, and they noticed. The trick is to never look like you're trying to divide. You don't need to whisper anything toxic or plant fake stories. That's not what this is about. It's about controlling your presence and letting your energy become more selective. When people don't feel sure about where they stand with you, they reveal more of who they really are. They ask more questions. They start paying attention. And that attention turns inward, toward their group. They start analyzing the behaviors of the people they once trusted. The manipulator's influence begins to crack, not because you confronted them, but because you stepped back just enough to let the room rebalance itself. This kind of quiet disruption requires emotional discipline. It's tempting to want to point fingers, to call things out, especially when you can see the manipulation so clearly, but that's exactly what they want. They want you to be the one who snaps, who exposes, who looks unstable. That makes it easier for them to tighten their grip on others. But if you can resist that urge, if you can stay composed while others chase control, you begin to reclaim the room without ever having to raise your voice. You don't break the circle by shouting at it. You break it by making it uncomfortable to stay in. As time passes, things start to shift naturally. People drift. They start seeking out different conversations. The manipulator feels it first, even if they don't show it. That tight little circle they built doesn't feel as safe anymore. Questions start to linger. Did someone say something? Is someone pulling strings? But they can't point to anything. That's the beauty of it. You never had to accuse. You never had to defend. You just made the environment less fertile for manipulation to grow. There's something deeply powerful about being the one in the room who doesn't need validation, who doesn't play for attention, who doesn't try to be liked by everyone. That presence, that quiet confidence, naturally disrupts the dynamics built on insecurity. People start noticing that you're not flattered easily, that you're not as available as before, that your words carry more weight because you use fewer of them. And in contrast, the manipulator begins to look a little too eager, a little too rehearsed. You don't have to say it out loud. The difference reveals itself. And if you hold your ground long enough, people start coming to you, not for gossip, not for drama, but for clarity. They'll ask subtle questions. They'll test your response. And when they see that you don't engage in manipulation or fuel conflict, they begin to trust your silence more than others' noise. That trust, that's influence, not the loud kind, the kind that moves people without force. And that's what breaks manipulation, not conflict, but contrast. The contrast between someone who needs power to feel secure and someone who is secure without needing power. The manipulator's biggest fear is not being exposed, it's being irrelevant. And when the people they once influenced stop needing their approval, their tactics fall flat. They talk and no one listens the same way. They suggest something and it's met with hesitation. The spotlight shifts, not because you grabbed it, but because you stayed rooted while everything else spun out. That's what Stoicism teaches us. Influence through presence, not performance. Let others lose balance, chasing attention. You remain the calm center, the one who doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't flinch. And that calmness is what eventually rewrites the room. 5. Show the cracks, don't point at them. There's a certain trap that's easy to fall into when you finally see someone's manipulation clearly. The urge to call it out, to expose it, to warn others, to shine a light on what's been happening in the shadows. But that impulse, though it feels righteous, often plays directly into the manipulator's hands. Because the moment you speak too loudly, too directly, too emotionally, they switch roles. They become the misunderstood one, the victim, the one being attacked by someone who's suddenly looking a bit too intense, a bit too reactive. And just like that, the room shifts. Doubt settles in, and you're no longer the person trying to bring truth. You're the one who looks unstable. That's why pointing doesn't work. It rarely convinces. But revealing? That's something else entirely. A manipulator survives on their ability to appear innocent. Their strength lies in their presentation, the mask, the timing, the well-placed words. So when you try to rip that mask off with your own hands, they make it look like you're the one doing harm. That's why the smarter move is not to accuse, but to observe out loud, to notice things, to ask thoughtful questions. Isn't it strange how this only comes up when she's not in the room? Didn't he say the opposite last week? These aren't attacks. They're small mirrors, and mirrors don't lie. They just reflect. The key is staying composed. You don't need to convince anyone of anything. You don't need to be the messenger of ultimate truth. All you need to do is offer subtle clarity where confusion once lived. Manipulators work in shadows. When you gently open the blinds, people begin to see for themselves. And people rarely change their minds because you told them to. They change when they begin to feel a gap between what they're being told and what they're starting to sense. That feeling grows stronger when your tone is calm, your words are precise, and your presence is grounded. The louder you are, the more defensive others become. But if you ask a calm question that highlights a contradiction, you plant a seed that grows quietly inside them. It might not sprout immediately, but it will, eventually. Carl Jung once wrote, "The most dangerous things are not our enemies, but the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge." The same is true in how we relate to others. Most people don't want to admit they've been misled. They don't want to see that someone they liked or admired was using them. So when you point too directly, you confront not just the manipulator, but the ego of everyone else involved. And the ego doesn't let go easily. That's why your goal isn't to tear down the mask. It's to let it crack on its own. And cracks form when reality and illusion begin to diverge too far to hold the same shape. There's an art to letting people draw their own conclusions. It takes patience. It takes restraint. It takes trusting that truth doesn't need to shout to be felt. When you bring up inconsistencies in a gentle tone, when you stay emotionally neutral, you allow the facts to do the work for you. You don't create drama. You don't look like you have an agenda. You simply hold space for the truth to become too obvious to ignore. Over time, people start to notice patterns. They remember moments that didn't make sense at the time. They revisit past interactions with a new lens. And once they start connecting the dots, they begin to see what was always there, but hidden in plain sight. That's when the real shift happens. Not when you force them to choose sides, but when they begin to question the story on their own. Because people hate being manipulated, but they hate being seen as gullible even more. And when they start to suspect that someone has been playing them, they become their own detective. They pay closer attention. They ask more questions. And slowly, the manipulator finds the ground under their feet becoming less stable. Not because you attacked, but because their own narrative stopped holding up under pressure. It's important, too, to understand your role in this. You're not there to destroy anyone. You're not the judge or the enforcer. You're just the one who sees. And that's powerful enough. You can change the entire dynamic of a room by being the only one who isn't fooled, who doesn't react, who doesn't give in to the performance. That kind of presence makes people feel safer. It invites reflection, not conflict. And in that reflection, things start to shift. The more you try to control how others see the manipulator, the more resistance you meet. But the less you try, and the more you just speak clearly, ask carefully, and live honestly, the more others start to feel the disconnect between truth and performance. You don't need to chase trust. You just need to become a reference point of honesty. And when people begin to lose their grip on the manipulator's version of events, they naturally seek out the calmest person in the room, the one who never reacted but always noticed. Even if it takes time, even if the shift is slow, it's real. And it's lasting, because once someone sees the crack, they can't unsee it. The illusion only works when it's whole. Once it's fractured, it falls apart with every repeated performance. And eventually the manipulator finds themselves talking louder, working harder, becoming more desperate to hold the room together. That's the irony. In trying to maintain their control, they reveal their desperation. And the very people they once influenced begin to step back, not because they were told to, but because they finally see what you saw all along. In the end, your strength lies in your calm awareness, in your ability to see without needing to be seen, to understand without demanding understanding, to speak when needed, and to stay silent when it matters more. The truth has its own rhythm. It doesn't need to rush. It just needs space. And if you create that space, without accusation, without ego, the truth will rise. It always does. Quietly, completely, and undeniably. 6. Make them need you. There's a kind of power that doesn't need to raise its voice or make a scene. It doesn't chase attention, doesn't beg to be seen, and never announces its value. But when it leaves the room, everyone notices. That's the kind of presence manipulators can't handle, because it reverses the entire game. You're not running after them, trying to prove your worth. You're letting your usefulness speak so loudly that they end up relying on you without even realizing it. And once they need you more than you need them, everything changes. Manipulators work by convincing people they have something others want: approval, information, connection, opportunity. They create a sense of scarcity, a quiet pressure that makes you feel like you have to impress them, win them over, or stay in their favor. But what if you flipped that? What if you became the one they couldn't replace? You don't need to beg for respect when you bring undeniable value to the table. Whether it's your skills, your insight, your calm under pressure, or your ability to execute when others can't, you become essential by doing what few are willing to do: deliver consistently, without drama, and without needing recognition. This isn't about becoming a servant or bending over backward. It's about being strategic with what you offer and when you offer it. You give just enough to make a difference. You solve a problem. You make something easier, faster, more effective. And then, just as they start to feel comfortable with your presence, you pull back. You become a little less available. You let your absence echo, because it's in the silence that they start to realize what they've lost. And in that realization, the dynamic starts to shift. There's no manipulation in being valuable. In fact, the more grounded your intentions are, the more powerful this becomes. You're not trying to trap anyone. You're simply letting your discipline and competence speak for themselves. And that's exactly what Stoic philosophy teaches. True strength isn't in how loud you speak, but in how well you carry yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one that's the foundation. Let your actions build the leverage, not your words, not your arguments, just your quiet consistency." When someone becomes dependent on you, not emotionally but functionally, because you help things work, because you solve what others complicate, they begin to overlook your silence. They excuse your distance. They tolerate your boundaries. And ironically, the more centered you stay, the more room they give you. You create a gap between how they treat others and how they treat you, because suddenly they know what they stand to lose. That doesn't mean you become cold or transactional. It means you choose when to show up fully. You choose how much to give. You learn the power of pacing, of offering just enough value without becoming a crutch. That's where control lives. Not in dominance, but in balance. Not in always being present, but in knowing the precise moment to step away. Manipulators can't hold on to people they don't understand. And when you become unpredictable, not in a chaotic way, but in a composed, intentional way, they can't read you. And what they can't read, they can't control. It's a strange thing, watching someone shift from dismissive to dependent. One day they're overlooking you. The next, they're waiting for your input, needing your insight, circling back for your approval. But you're not rushing to give it. You're not being rude. You're being measured. You show up with calm energy. You contribute when it makes sense. And when your work is done, you disappear without noise. That silence speaks louder than anything else. It says, "I don't need you to need me." But you do. And that imbalance, that's where the manipulation starts to crumble. Because the truth is, manipulators are drawn to people who want something: attention, connection, validation. That desire is the thread they pull on. But when you remove that desire, when you no longer need anything from them, they have nothing to leverage. And if you reverse the flow, if they start to need what you provide, the thread slips out of their hands. They can't push your buttons if they don't know where they are. They can't withhold approval if you're not seeking it. They can't play hot and cold if you've already found your own temperature. You become the calm in the storm, the steady presence they try to predict. And when they realize they can't replace you, they get quiet. Not out of respect, but out of uncertainty. Because in their world, people compete for attention. They chase proximity. But you walk your own path, and if they want access, they have to adjust to your pace. That's not arrogance. That's ownership of your time, your energy, your presence. You offer it like a gift, not a transaction. And that alone creates a dynamic few manipulators can survive. What's even more powerful is what happens when you pair that usefulness with detachment, when you provide value not because you want to be liked, but because it's who you are. And then, when your work is done, you step back with no explanation, no emotional follow-up, just quiet exit. That space, your absence, forces reflection. It makes people realize the weight you were carrying, the things you did that they didn't notice, and most of all, the stability you brought into the environment. That's when they come looking. That's when they reach out. But you're no longer reacting. You're observing. Because once someone shows you they need you more than you need them, you gain a kind of freedom most people never experience. The freedom to say yes with intention or no without guilt. The freedom to lead without being loud. The freedom to walk away without needing closure. That's real power. Quiet, calm, and undeniable. The kind that doesn't shout, doesn't chase, and never begs to be seen, because it already knows its worth. 7. Mirror their energy until it collapses. Manipulators need movement. They need to see you flinch, hesitate, defend, or bend. That's how they know they're in control, by watching how much of yourself you give away in response to their performance. But what happens when you don't resist? When, instead of pushing back or falling into their frame, you simply reflect it back at them, like a mirror. That subtle shift changes everything, because mirrors don't react. They don't explain or correct. They just show. And when someone sees their own behavior reflected calmly, without judgment, without distortion, it gets uncomfortable very quickly. This isn't about mimicking someone to mock or manipulate them in return. It's about becoming emotionally still, present but unreadable. When they lie, you don't rush to expose them. You nod, just enough to let them think they're being heard. Then you ask a question, gently, without accusation, that doesn't attack, but reveals. Something like, "Didn't you say something different last time?" That one question holds a mirror up. Suddenly they're looking at themselves, and there's no emotional reaction to use against you. No fight to turn into drama, just quiet reflection. And in that silence, cracks begin to show. Manipulators rely on rhythm. They create a loop of praise, guilt, blame, affection, whatever keeps you emotionally engaged and slightly off balance. If you get angry, they play calm. If you cry, they act disappointed. It's a script, and it only works when you play your part. But the moment you stop reacting predictably, the script breaks. When they flatter you, you smile and say thank you, and then change the subject. When they provoke, you respond with calm curiosity. They don't know where you're going anymore, and that uncertainty makes them nervous. When a manipulator can't figure out why you're not reacting, why you're not arguing or trying to fix things, they begin to look inward. Not in a reflective or healing way, but in a paranoid one. They start overanalyzing themselves, repeating things, explaining when you didn't ask. That's the energy unraveling. That's the performance collapsing. This strategy only works if you stay calm. The mirror doesn't work if it distorts. That means no sarcasm, no smugness, no passive-aggressive jabs. You're not trying to win an argument. You're trying to reveal patterns. And sometimes the best way to do that is to stop giving them resistance. Because when they lose the conflict, they lose the fuel. And when you stay neutral, their extremes become more visible to everyone around them. You don't need to call it out. You just need to let the contrast do the work. It's especially effective when you notice repeated behaviors. If someone constantly interrupts, you pause and let the silence hang. If they give fake compliments, you return one with the same tone, then let it fall flat. The energy bounces back, and suddenly they're the only one in motion. That imbalance is powerful, because manipulators don't know what to do with stillness. They can't twist it, they can't blame it, and they can't feed on it. It forces them to face their own pattern without your emotions interfering. It might feel unnatural at first, especially if you're someone who's used to justifying yourself or trying to be kind. But mirroring isn't about being cold. It's about being clear. You're not pretending. You're just no longer giving them access to your emotional reactions. You're not absorbing their tactics. You're reflecting them gently, so they have to sit with the energy they're trying to project onto you. That's when you start to see the cracks form, not just in their behavior, but in the way others see them too. People around you begin to notice the shift. They see how calm you remain while the other person escalates. They hear the contradiction in the manipulator's words because you're not arguing over them. You've created space for the truth to emerge naturally. That's how you reclaim the room, not by being louder, but by being clearer, by letting their energy stand beside yours and allowing others to feel the difference. The more you practice this, the more you realize how often people try to pull you into their chaos. Some do it consciously, some don't even realize they're doing it. But either way, the mirror works, because it doesn't attack, it doesn't absorb, it reflects. And that reflection makes people pause. They hear their own words with fresh ears. They feel the weight of their tone, the hollowness of their tactics. And without anyone saying a word, the manipulation begins to crumble. You'll know it's working when they start acting confused, when they ask if everything's okay, even though you've done nothing but match their tone, when they repeat themselves, when they suddenly shift tactics. That's not strength, that's a loss of control. But you don't respond, you let the shift unfold naturally. The moment you return to your old reactions, they'll pounce. But if you hold your stillness, the performance keeps falling apart. And when it finally does, when they realize they can't push you, pull you, or play you, they start looking elsewhere. Because manipulation can't survive in places where energy doesn't react. It needs drama. It needs movement. It needs emotional feedback. But your calm presence, your quiet mirror, gives it nothing to grip onto. That's the point. You don't destroy the manipulator. You let their own behavior destroy the illusion they were holding together. By choosing not to react, you become something rare, unbothered, unreadable. And in a world where so many are easily shaken, that stillness is magnetic. It speaks of strength without force, truth without noise, power without threat. You don't need to fight back. You just need to become the kind of person who can't be baited. And when they finally realize their tricks don't work on you anymore, it's already too late. The collapse has already begun. 8. Kill the pattern with stillness. Manipulators don't operate well in silence. They can't thrive where there's structure, steadiness, or predictability. What fuels their game is instability, your emotional swings, your doubts, your unpredictable reactions. The more off balance you are, the easier you are to influence. That's how they get in. Not through brute force, but through little moments of chaos. They provoke a reaction, then feed off what comes next. And most of the time, people don't even notice it's happening. They just think they're having a bad day, or they're being too sensitive, or they need to explain themselves better. But what's really happening is deeper than that. It's a pattern being built and reinforced every time you break your own rhythm to match theirs. The moment you bring stillness into that chaos, the pattern starts to crack. Stillness doesn't mean inaction. It doesn't mean silence out of fear. It's something else, an internal posture of calm, of steadiness, of not being pulled into someone else's emotional weather. When you wake up at the same time every day, when your decisions come from your values instead of your moods, when you stay consistent in how you speak, move and think, something happens. You stop becoming readable. You stop being available for emotional games. You start becoming uninteresting to someone who needs unpredictability to stay in control. Routine may sound dull, even robotic to some, but for those who understand its power, it becomes a shield. A grounded life isn't a life without feeling. It's a life with direction. When you have direction, you're not as easily swayed by guilt trips, passive aggression, or emotional bait. That text you would have responded to immediately. You don't now, not because you're avoiding it, but because your time is already directed somewhere else. That jab that once triggered you into over-explaining, it now passes through you without landing because you've seen it before and you're no longer pulled into the same reaction loop. Carl Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." Patterns don't break by accident. You have to see them, name them, and then refuse to feed them. And that requires discipline, not just once, but daily. Every time you choose to stay on your path instead of stepping into their drama, you cut off the oxygen supply that keeps their manipulation alive. You stop playing the game. And eventually, without resistance to feed on, they lose interest. Not because you pushed them away, but because you gave them nothing to hold on to. Stillness is uncomfortable for manipulators because it leaves them alone with themselves. They can't twist your words if you're not talking. They can't escalate a conflict if you're not reacting. They can't create emotional leverage if you're not offering your emotions as currency. You strip away their favorite tools, surprise, confusion, emotional swings, and replace it with rhythm, clarity, and peace. And peace is the one thing they can't handle, because peace requires accountability, and accountability reveals intention. You'll know you're killing the pattern when things start feeling boring, in the best way. The drama feels unnecessary. The anxiety fades. The overthinking softens. You no longer replay conversations in your head trying to figure out where things went wrong because you didn't get pulled off course. You didn't abandon your center. You stayed aligned. And that alignment gives you a power that doesn't need to speak loudly. It shows up in how little access people have to your emotional temperature. They don't know what you'll say next, not because you're unpredictable, but because you're unshakable. It's not easy to live this way, especially if you've been trained to accommodate others at the cost of your own peace. But once you begin building this internal routine, this quiet rhythm that guides your life, you start to feel how much you've been giving away in the form of reaction. You start to see how many of your decisions were based on avoiding discomfort rather than following clarity. And when that realization hits, you can't go back. You don't want to go back, because the strength that comes from inner structure is more valuable than any momentary victory in an argument or emotional game. There's a quiet kind of authority in a person who can walk into chaos and not be moved by it. Someone who doesn't need to defend, doesn't need to match the energy in the room, doesn't even need to win. They just keep doing what they've always done, show up clear, act with purpose, speak with intention. Over time, that steadiness becomes a mirror. It reflects the noise back at those who create it. And when they see themselves through your calm, they either adjust or they leave. Not because you pushed them out, but because there's no chaos to attach to anymore. The goal isn't to become cold, it's to become consistent. The kind of person whose peace isn't easily disturbed, the kind of presence that changes the temperature of a room just by entering it, not through control, but through example. Manipulators look for cracks, they test boundaries, they probe for weak spots. But when all they find is discipline, when they realize you respond the same on a bad day as you do on a good one, they begin to understand there's nothing for them to twist. Stillness isn't passive, it's deliberate. It's built through repetition. It's what happens when you stop waiting for others to set your tone and start building your own. And once you find that tone, once your days start running on purpose instead of reaction, you become someone who's no longer interesting to play with. You become too calm to provoke, too structured to confuse, too focused to control. And slowly the pattern dies, not with a fight, not with a loud confrontation, but with silence, predictability, and the kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself. Keep waking up early, keep doing the work, keep showing up the same way, no matter who's watching. And when the chaos returns looking for a place to land, let it pass. Not because you're avoiding life, but because you've finally built one that doesn't need to react to everyone else's. And in that life, manipulation has no room to survive. It simply fades, because you no longer make space for it. 9. Build a fortress, not a cage. Manipulators don't just target individuals, they study environments. They look for weak links, not just in people, but in dynamics. That's why a strong person surrounded by instability can still be brought down. It's not about how disciplined you are in isolation. It's about the kind of space you build around you, the people you let in, the energy you tolerate, the conversations you entertain. If your environment is scattered, dramatic, or built on shallow connections, it becomes fertile ground for someone who knows how to stir conflict and feed off division. That's why the wisest thing you can do is not just strengthen yourself, but fortify the space you move in. A manipulator won't walk into a room full of grounded people and announce their intentions. They'll test the waters, say something vague, drop a subtle jab, offer a compliment that doesn't feel quite right. And then they'll watch. Who laughs? Who stays quiet? Who joins in? They're looking for cracks in the foundation. People who need validation. People who want to be liked. People who struggle with boundaries. Because that's where they begin to weave their influence. And once they find that opening, it spreads. One word at a time. One conversation at a time. Until the group shifts little by little into a place where truth feels like confrontation and silence feels like suspicion. That's why it's not enough to just avoid toxic people. You have to become intentional about the soil you plant yourself in. Are you surrounded by people who hold themselves accountable, who speak clearly but kindly, who can handle conflict without turning it into chaos? Because if not, you'll always be on edge. Never because of what's said, but because of what's constantly implied, manipulated, or misunderstood. Stoic philosophy teaches us to guard our peace not just in moments of solitude, but in the spaces we choose to belong to. You don't need 100 voices around you. You need a few steady ones, the kind that don't flinch when truth is spoken, the kind that don't shift depending on who's in the room. Building a fortress isn't about becoming rigid or cold. It's about setting a standard. It's about deciding what kind of energy you're available for and making that clear without having to constantly explain yourself. You don't need to convince anyone to respect your boundaries. You just have to enforce them consistently, And those who can't handle that distance will remove themselves. That's the filter. The ones who stay, that's your circle. Not because they agree with everything you say, but because they understand what it means to stand beside someone who doesn't play games. Carl Jung once noted that loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important. That's the tragedy of a weak environment. You could be surrounded by people and still feel alone, still feel like your clarity is too much, your truth too sharp, your silence too heavy. But the right people, those who are doing the work, who are aware of their patterns, who are not afraid to name things for what they are, those people create a space where manipulation cannot survive. Because there's no need for masks in rooms that value honesty. A strong environment won't always be peaceful, but it will always be clear. Arguments might happen, disagreements might show up, but they won't turn into blame games or gossip sessions. They won't linger in the shadows, poisoning relationships quietly. That's what manipulators need: ambiguity, unspoken tension, people too afraid to confront things directly. But when the air is clear, when feedback is given with love and received without ego, there's no room to hide. That clarity is what makes the walls of your fortress. Not isolation, but intention. You start to feel the shift when conversations become healthier, when you don't have to watch your every word, when you know that even if someone misunderstands you, they'll come to you, not go around you. That kind of trust doesn't show up by accident. It's built, slowly, through choosing people who don't feed on drama, who take responsibility, who aren't addicted to conflict, but aren't afraid of it either. People who stay when it's uncomfortable, not because they're stuck, but because they care enough to work through the tension. It might mean walking away from certain crowds. It might mean outgrowing some old friendships, not because you're better, but because you're clearer, because you finally understand that peace isn't just something you feel inside, it's something you protect outside too. And that kind of peace has a cost. You'll have fewer voices around you, but the ones that remain will hold weight. They'll remind you of your standards when you're slipping. They'll check you with love when you're off. And most importantly, they'll never twist your truth into something it wasn't. Manipulators don't survive in well-lit rooms. They can't twist the story when everyone's paying attention. They can't divide when no one is interested in picking sides. So if you want to remove the threat, not just for yourself, but for the people you care about, you build the kind of environment that doesn't need permission to be honest, that doesn't reward passive aggression, secrecy, or shallow flattery. You build it one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, until your life becomes a place where manipulation simply has no use. Not because you fought it, but because you made it irrelevant. 10. Give them just enough rope. Most people, when they sense manipulation, want to strike back. They want to pull the mask off, show everyone the truth, catch the liar in the act. But that urgency is emotional. It comes from a place of pain, from betrayal, from the need to be seen and heard and validated. And manipulators know this. They're counting on it, because if you act too soon, if you try to confront them before the room is ready, you end up looking like the problem, not them. The truth isn't always welcomed, especially when it challenges what people want to believe. That's why you wait, you observe, and you let them keep talking. A manipulator doesn't usually know when they're being watched with clarity. They mistake silence for ignorance. They assume your politeness means you're still buying the act. That's what gives them confidence. And confidence in their hands is dangerous, but also revealing. Because the more power they think they have, the more careless they become. The lies get bigger, the stories get sloppier, the tone becomes arrogant. And slowly, without any pushback, they start to overstep. What once looked like charm begins to look like control. What once felt persuasive starts to feel rehearsed, and people begin to notice. Letting someone talk isn't weakness, it's strategy. When someone is performing, you don't interrupt the show. You let them finish their script. You let the audience settle. And then, when the contradictions start piling up, you don't point them out. You just let them echo. Because manipulation doesn't collapse under confrontation. It collapses under its own weight. People don't trust because you told them to. They trust because they saw something for themselves. That's why timing matters more than truth. The truth can be right, but if it arrives too early, it gets rejected. Too late, and the damage is already done. But just in time, it shifts the room. This requires discipline. It means biting your tongue when you'd rather defend yourself. It means holding your ground when others still haven't seen what you see. It means walking through moments of isolation where you're the only one who knows what's really happening. But that quiet strength, that ability to keep your peace while others are being drawn into a game you've already decoded, that's rare, and it's powerful. Because when the moment finally comes, when the manipulator pushes too far and people start connecting the dots, you don't need to say much. The room starts to turn on its own. Carl Jung once said, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul." And that's exactly what drives most manipulation. It's not always malice, it's avoidance, a refusal to be seen for who they are. So they create stories, roles, versions of themselves that can keep people close without ever revealing what's underneath. But the thing about pretending for too long is that it gets exhausting. The cracks start to show. And when no one rushes to fix those cracks, when no one reacts or reassures or takes the bait, they widen. Giving someone rope doesn't mean you're giving them control. It means you're giving them the space to show who they are without your interference. It's tempting to want to speed up that process, to push the truth to the surface. But forcing people to see what they're not ready to confront rarely ends well. That's why your silence is important. Not just for your own clarity, but for the integrity of the truth itself. It's not about winning. It's about letting reality unfold without forcing it. You'll know the rope is tightening when they start repeating themselves, when they bring up your name in rooms you're not in, when they try harder and harder to be liked, to be trusted, to stay in control. But you're not responding. You're not fueling the fire. And that absence, your refusal to dance, creates a pressure they're not used to, because now they're doing all the talking. They're carrying the entire performance, and eventually they trip over their own words. The most damaging kind of exposure isn't loud, it's quiet. It's when the people around them begin to shift, when eyes narrow, when tones change, when support softens, not because someone said something, but because the energy isn't landing the same way anymore. That's what real exposure looks like. Not confrontation, not proof, but shift. And it's permanent. What you're doing in these moments is holding a mirror, not up to the manipulator, but to everyone else. And in that mirror, people begin to see who's calm and who's performing, who's consistent and who's desperate, who speaks when needed and who speaks too often. And when the room starts to wake up, you don't need to step in. The rope has done its work. They've said too much, twisted too far, reached too deep, and the consequences were built into their own behavior. This doesn't mean you don't protect yourself. You set boundaries, you limit access, you step back, but you don't try to force exposure. That's the difference. You don't need to destroy someone. You just need to stop feeding the illusion. Let the silence do its work. Let the overconfidence carry the weight. And when it collapses, let it fall without commentary. This level of restraint is uncommon, but it's what makes you untouchable. People who can't be provoked, who can't be baited, who can't be lured into emotional traps. They're dangerous to those who depend on manipulation, because they can't be mapped, they can't be predicted, and that unpredictability is what makes you powerful. When you feel the urge to step in, to speak up, to correct the story, pause. Ask yourself if the rope is already doing the work, if the show is already collapsing, if the truth is already circling, getting ready to land. And if it is, stay still, say little, watch carefully, because in the end, the strongest statement you can make is to let someone expose themselves, slowly, in their own words, with no one to save them, and no one to blame but themselves. 11. Master the power of the redirect. When someone accuses you of something that feels wildly off base, your first instinct is almost always to defend yourself, to clear it up, to explain what you really meant, what actually happened, or what they must have misunderstood. That impulse is natural. It comes from wanting to be understood, wanting things to make sense, wanting to fix the discomfort in the air. But that very impulse is often the door manipulators are waiting for you to walk through. Because once you start defending yourself, you've entered their territory. Now they're in control of the conversation, and you're chasing clarity in a space they've already filled with confusion. That's why the smarter move is not to defend, it's to redirect. Redirection doesn't mean avoiding the issue. It means shifting the responsibility of clarity back where it belongs. When someone accuses you and you calmly ask, "Why do you think that?" the energy shifts. You're not rejecting the question, you're turning it around. You're inviting them to explain, to expose their logic. And that makes a lot of manipulators uncomfortable, because their strength is in implication, not explanation. They want to suggest something wrong with you without having to prove it. They want the room to fill in the blanks. But when you calmly ask for clarity, you force them to get specific. And the more specific they get, the harder it becomes to twist the narrative. It's a subtle move, but it's powerful. You're not matching their emotion. You're not meeting fire with fire. You're just standing still, with a calm voice and a steady gaze, and asking them to walk themselves through their own accusation. That alone can be enough to make them hesitate, because now they have to slow down, they have to think. And manipulators don't thrive in slow, thoughtful spaces. They thrive in speed, in chaos, in emotional turbulence. They throw things at you hoping you'll stumble. But if you pause, redirect, and hold your ground, they're left dealing with the weight of their own words. The things others try to project onto you often say more about them than you. That's why redirecting is so effective. It puts the focus back on where the accusation came from, not in an aggressive way, not as a trap, but as a way to bring things into the open. And when things are open, they're harder to manipulate. Clarity ruins confusion, and confusion is where most manipulation hides. It's not just about protecting yourself from false accusations. It's about setting a new rhythm in the conversation, one that's based on logic, not emotion, on calm reflection, not panic. And once you set that rhythm, you'll be surprised how quickly the tone changes. The person accusing you now has to shift their posture. They have to either get honest or get out, because your lack of reaction offers no fuel. You're not arguing, defending, or pleasing. You're just calmly requesting clarity. Sometimes you'll get silence in return. Sometimes you'll get a long circular answer that goes nowhere. And sometimes they'll double down, hoping to shake you loose. But the beauty of this technique is that it works best when you say less. When you ask one question, then wait. When you don't rush to fill the silence. When you don't get pulled into their tempo. That waiting is where your power is, because it exposes the gap between accusation and truth. And the longer that gap hangs in the air, the more people around you begin to feel it too. You're not trying to win, You're trying to hold the standard. And the standard is this: if someone wants to make a claim about your character, your actions, or your intentions, they should be able to back it up. They should be able to stand behind their words with clarity and confidence. And if they can't, then maybe it wasn't truth to begin with. Maybe it was control dressed as concern. That's why redirection doesn't feel aggressive, but it lands deeply. Because it doesn't fight back, but it doesn't bow down either. It stands still. And manipulators are used to movement. They're used to provoking a chase. But when you stop running, when you stop chasing validation, they're left standing in their own discomfort. That discomfort is often the beginning of the end of their strategy. This approach also trains you to be more emotionally disciplined. You start noticing how often people say things just to get a reaction. How accusations aren't always about truth. They're often about power. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start using questions more than statements. You listen more than you explain. And in doing so, you become someone who's not easy to rattle. Someone who doesn't panic when tension rises. Someone who redirects instead of reacts. It takes practice. In the beginning, you'll still feel the urge to explain. You'll feel your body tense up, your thoughts rush, your need to fix things spike. But the moment you choose a question over a defense, everything slows down. And that slowness, that controlled pace, is exactly what manipulative people can't stand. Because they lose their grip when you don't match their energy, when you invite them into yours instead. Over time, people learn that they can't twist your emotions, that you don't play in ambiguity, that you value clarity over comfort, and that reputation protects you. People begin to notice who can stand still when things get messy, who keeps their voice steady, who asks the right questions instead of launching into long explanations. And slowly, the environment around you changes, not because you fought everyone, but because you mastered the redirect, because you showed that calm doesn't mean passive and stillness doesn't mean weak. It means you know where your power is and you're not afraid to use it. 12. Become tactically unavailable. Most people are addicted to being available, always online, always answering, always explaining. And in that constant access, they unknowingly surrender control. Manipulators thrive in that space. They watch your patterns, they measure your habits, and they test the doors you never lock. They learn exactly when to text you, exactly how to ask, and exactly how long it takes before you cave. But the moment you break that rhythm, even slightly, they begin to lose their grip. Because what they crave more than anything is predictability, and what threatens them most is silence they can't interpret. Being tactically unavailable doesn't mean becoming distant, cold, or detached from life. It means being deliberate with your energy. It means stepping out of the game they're trying to play before you even sit at the table. Not answering immediately, not showing up to every little drama, not being the predictable source of attention, advice, or reaction. This subtle unpredictability is powerful because it shifts the dynamic. You're no longer the person they can rely on to be pulled into their orbit. You're now the person who moves on their own terms, and that unsettles people who rely on control. We're conditioned to believe that silence must be filled, that a delay is rude, that space means something's wrong. But often, space is exactly what's needed to gain perspective. You don't need to respond instantly to things that aren't urgent. You don't need to say yes just to avoid discomfort. And you certainly don't need to explain your every move to people who haven't earned that access. Boundaries aren't walls, they're filters. And when you stop giving instant access to everyone, you find out very quickly who was there for control, not connection. Carl Jung once said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, and that becoming often requires distance. Distance from noise, distance from manipulation, and most importantly, distance from the expectation that you owe every piece of yourself to people who wouldn't notice if you vanished, unless they needed something. That's the trap. Manipulators don't always want you. They want your reaction, your openness, your vulnerability, your pattern. So if you want to protect your peace, make your rhythm unpredictable. Disappear for a few hours. Skip a conversation. Delay a response. Not to punish, but to preserve. When you become less accessible, you become more respected, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. They can't anticipate your energy, so they tread more carefully. And in that caution, you regain control. You remind them without words that your presence is not a given. It's a decision. That you're not here to be managed. You're here to be observed from a distance until you choose to engage. There's a difference between being mysterious and being unclear. You don't need to play games or act aloof to create space. You just need to prioritize stillness over stimulation, intentionality over reaction, presence over performance. You don't need to fake disinterest. You simply stop giving immediate responses to those who only show up when they need a piece of you. And that shift in your behavior creates a ripple effect. Suddenly they can't plan around you. Suddenly your silence speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. The beauty of being tactically unavailable is that it naturally attracts sincerity. The people who are genuine won't panic when you go quiet. They won't take your pause as an insult. They'll respect your timing because they have their own. But the manipulators, they'll flinch, they'll press, they'll guilt, they'll escalate. That reaction tells you everything. It tells you they were never interested in your well-being, just in your availability. And that truth is freeing. Not every message deserves a reply. Not every request deserves your energy. And not every invitation is a compliment. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for yourself is not show up, not answer, not participate. And watch how quickly the energy shifts. It's not about ghosting or avoidance. It's about creating a sacred space between your peace and their need for control. You step back just enough to see clearly, but not so far that you lose the strength to respond if it ever becomes necessary. When you show people that you're not desperate for attention, they start to question why they are. When you show that your time has value, they start to realize how much of theirs they've wasted on tactics. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to make a grand statement. You just have to quietly reallocate your focus toward yourself, your purpose, your path. And when you do, the noise fades. The strength in this approach lies in the calmness it creates. You're no longer performing. You're no longer adjusting your mood to fit theirs. You're not watching the clock, waiting to be summoned. You're living, moving, breathing at your own pace. And manipulators who rely on urgency, on immediacy, on drama, they don't know how to follow you there. That distance, that unavailability, that's not disconnection, that's power. Being unavailable isn't about being better than anyone. It's about being better to yourself. It's about refusing to live on someone else's emotional schedule. It's about recognizing that access to your time, your mind, your emotional space is a privilege, not a right. And the moment you start treating it that way, you attract people who value you for who you are, not for what they can pull from you on demand. Let them wonder where you went. Let them sit with the quiet. Let them feel the weight of a message unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because you've finally realized your peace doesn't come from being understood by everyone. It comes from understanding yourself deeply enough to know when to stay and when to step away. 13. Let results speak louder than loyalty. Some people are masters of saying the right thing at the right time. They speak of loyalty like it's a badge they've earned just by being near you. They make promises, give speeches, use words like always, forever, and you can count on me. But when the moment of truth arrives, when pressure exposes who's real and who's rehearsed, they vanish or shift blame. That's the thing about manipulators. They don't build trust through consistency. They mimic the language of loyalty to mask the absence of it. And if you're not careful, you'll end up rewarding their performance instead of their reality. It's easy to get swept up in declarations. We all want to believe that the people around us have our backs. But loyalty isn't what someone says when things are smooth. It's who they become when things fall apart. When you're doubted, attacked, challenged, do they stand beside you, or do they step back and play neutral? Because silence in those moments speaks volumes, and it's in those quiet betrayals that you start to see who was clapping for you only when it cost them nothing. Carl Jung once said, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." That statement cuts straight through the fog, because so many manipulators know how to create the illusion of being dependable. They know how to mirror your language, your goals, your pain, just enough to earn your trust. But they don't invest in the heavy lifting. They don't show up when the emotional bill arrives. And that's when you must learn to watch more and listen less. It's not cynicism, it's clarity. Every time someone tells you how loyal they are, take a step back and ask yourself, what have they actually done when it mattered? Have they shown consistency? Have they followed through even when it was inconvenient? Or did they disappear when you needed steady ground? Manipulators often rely on emotional deposits. They flatter you, agree with you, act interested. But the moment your needs disrupt their agenda, their loyalty fractures. You'll see it in the small things first: delayed responses, half-kept promises, vague excuses. It always starts subtly. You don't need to confront them. You don't need to accuse or demand explanations. That gives them room to perform again, to twist the script, to tell you what you want to hear, to reapply the mask. What you do instead is you shift your attention from their words to their track record. That's where the truth is. Did they come through when it mattered, not when it was easy? Did they stay steady when doubt entered the room? Did they remain loyal when there was no applause? What you reward, you reinforce. So if you keep praising the performance, you'll keep attracting actors. If you keep honoring words over action, you'll keep surrounding yourself with people who rehearse instead of commit. And over time, that drains you. Not just emotionally, but psychologically, because deep down, you begin to question your own instincts. You begin to think maybe loyalty is just a game of appearances, and you start lowering your standards. But when you start rewarding results, quiet consistency, follow-through, integrity under pressure, you'll notice something different. The crowd around you will thin out, the noise will die down, but the ones who remain, those are your people, the ones who didn't need to broadcast their loyalty, they simply lived it. They didn't need to say, "I've got you," 100 times. They just did. And those are the ones worth investing in. In the presence of real loyalty, you'll feel safer, not more confused. There won't be a need for constant reassurance or dramatic gestures. There will be a rhythm, a reliability, a sense that even when the world shakes, this person won't shift with the wind. But to find those people, you have to become someone who values evidence over emotion. Not cold, not hardened, just wiser, more alert, less impressed by the script, and more focused on the substance. This doesn't mean you stop believing in loyalty. It means you start defining it by standards, not sentiments. It means when someone says, "I'll always be there," you quietly observe and wait for the chance life gives them to prove it. You give them space to show who they are, not who they pretend to be, and in that space you stay calm. You stop chasing. You stop pouring into people who only know how to receive. And slowly, you build a circle that isn't loud, but solid. Manipulators often think their words are shields. They believe if they say all the right things, you won't look deeper. That's the mistake. Let them talk. Let them paint their version of loyalty. You don't interrupt. You don't argue. You observe. You watch how they behave when the spotlight is gone, when loyalty becomes inconvenient, when being there for you demands something from them. That's when their true role is revealed, not the character they auditioned for. You don't need a large crowd. You need the right few. And you'll find them when you stop rewarding promises and start honoring proof. The people who show up without needing to be reminded. The ones who follow through when it's uncomfortable. The ones who stay silent about their loyalty because they don't need credit for it. They just live it. That's the kind of presence that builds strength around you. Loyalty is not loud. It's not poetic. It doesn't always come with grand speeches or perfect timing. Sometimes it's a quiet check-in. Sometimes it's unseen support. But always, it's consistent. So stop giving your energy to the loudest voices. Start giving it to the steadiest hands. Because in the end, the ones who stood with you in silence are worth more than the ones who only praised you in public. And when you learn to see that difference, you'll never be fooled by words again. 14. Use kindness as a weapon. They expect you to be angry, to argue, to match their tension with your own. That's how most people respond to manipulation or betrayal, with confrontation or cold revenge. But what if you didn't? What if instead of reacting with force, you responded with grace? A quiet, composed kind of kindness, not weakness, not submission, but a calm, unsettling generosity. The kind of energy that makes them wonder what you're really thinking. Because when someone expects war and receives warmth, they lose their footing. They don't know which script to follow anymore. And that's where your power begins. Most manipulators thrive on predictable reactions. They bait you with drama, hoping you'll explode. They feed on defensiveness. They want to see you flinch, lose your cool, or strike back. Because once you do, they regain control. But when you answer manipulation with poise, when you smile and stay generous, not in a naive way but in a calculated one, it fractures their rhythm. They're left scrambling, trying to adjust to a game they can no longer control. You've stepped off the chessboard and started playing by your own rules. That's far more dangerous than any loud retaliation. This isn't about pretending to be kind. It's about choosing your emotional response with surgical precision. There's an art to giving just enough kindness to disarm, just enough warmth to seem open, while keeping your inner world untouched. It's not fake, it's intentional. And it leaves people confused. They thought they had you figured out. They thought their behavior would bring out the worst in you. But instead you greeted them with silence wrapped in respect, with clarity wrapped in grace. And now they're left wondering if maybe they misunderstood you or underestimated you. And when you meet hostility with calm, it's not just about exposing others, it's also a powerful mirror for yourself. You realize how much you've grown. You realize how little control others actually have over your emotional state. That realization is liberation. It's not kindness for the sake of approval. It's kindness as a calculated move, a sign that you are no longer reactive, no longer driven by the chaos they tried to pull you into. You're not giving them kindness because they deserve it. You're giving it because it creates space, space between their strategy and your energy, space between their chaos and your stillness. It's not permanent. It's not permission. It's the smoke screen. While they believe the storm has passed, while they start relaxing, thinking they've won you over or guilted you into staying, you're already detaching, already stepping back, already preparing your exit. No dramatic goodbyes, no last-minute fights, just silence, just distance, just clarity. Because when you leave without warning, after treating someone better than they treated you, it leaves an echo. They sit with that. It haunts them. They can't call you bitter. They can't call you unstable. They can't blame you for burning bridges, because there was no fire, just an empty room where you once stood. And that's what breaks them. Not your revenge, not your anger, but your calm withdrawal. It forces them to confront their own behavior without distractions. And that is something most manipulators aren't built to survive. But make no mistake, this form of kindness is not about forgiveness. It's not about turning the other cheek endlessly or being a doormat. It's about self-possession. It's about emotional discipline. You're not handing over power, you're reclaiming it quietly. You're using kindness as camouflage, as a cloak, as a way to exit clean, without debt, without mess. You leave with your dignity intact, your energy preserved, and in that process they lose something far more important than an argument. They lose access, because access is the real power. Who gets your time, your energy, your presence? Manipulators thrive when you feel the need to explain yourself, when you argue, when you defend your decision to walk away. But when you've been kind the whole way through, when you've offered calm responses and quiet dignity, your exit requires no justification. It becomes untouchable, unchallengeable. It speaks louder than any accusation. And what they're left with is silence that demands reflection. You see, most people expect relationships, whether personal or professional, to end with noise, with anger, with chaos, with accusations. But when you end it with kindness, you take away their story. You remove the drama they would use to protect themselves from facing the truth. And without that story, all that's left is the mirror. A mirror that shows them how deeply they failed someone who only ever showed grace. And if they try to reach out again, if they come back, trying to test the waters, your stillness becomes the message. You don't engage, you don't reopen wounds. You've said everything you needed to say through your behavior, through the kindness you offered, through the absence you created. You don't chase closure, you don't demand recognition. You simply live forward, grounded, calm, untouchable. That's the beauty of this strategy. It's quiet, but not passive. It's kind, but not weak. It's strategic, but not cruel. It's the highest level of emotional control, to respond with presence when provoked, and to exit with peace when wronged. This is not about being nice for approval. This is about choosing a higher weapon, one that doesn't destroy, but exposes, and in exposing, reveals the truth. Kindness, when wielded with precision, reveals who is real and who is not. It reveals who is grounded and who is chaotic. And most importantly, it reveals who you've become. You no longer give people the power to disrupt your inner world. You no longer reward drama with attention. You no longer waste your breath trying to prove your worth to people who only understand control. You let them think they've won. You let them feel safe. And then, without venom, without vengeance, you walk. You disappear from the stage. And they are left speaking lines to a character who no longer exists. That is the art. That is the weapon. Kindness, not for them, but for your own freedom. Kindness that ends the cycle without feeding the fire. Kindness that doesn't bow, but closes the door once and for all. 15. Never try to teach them a lesson. They'll push you. They'll test your limits. And when you finally see through the pattern, when the lies, guilt trips, and silent treatments no longer work, the urge to teach them a lesson can feel overwhelming. You want them to understand what they did. You want them to feel what you felt, to realize how deeply they've crossed the line. But that's not wisdom speaking. That's your ego. It wants closure, justice. a sense of moral balance. But manipulators don't learn through lectures. They don't grow through confrontation. And the more you try to teach them, the more they twist the narrative until you're the one who looks unstable, emotional, or cruel. That's how they win. Not by overpowering you, but by pulling you into their chaos and making you dance to their rhythm. Real power is in restraint. Not the kind of restraint that hides weakness, but the kind that reveals how little their behavior affects your peace. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop trying to be understood, that's when you rise above the dynamic. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to point out their flaws for them to feel the consequences. Silence does the job better. Distance speaks louder. Absence becomes the loudest statement you can ever make. It doesn't scream, it echoes. Epictetus said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." And when you choose not to react, not to teach, not to correct, you protect your energy. Manipulators don't operate in silence. They thrive on reaction, on emotional highs and lows, on being the center of your focus, whether through love or hate. But when you go quiet, not cold, not bitter, just still, they begin to lose their grip. Their control weakens not because you fought back, but because you stopped playing altogether. Teaching someone a lesson assumes they care enough to learn. It assumes they have the self-awareness to reflect. But manipulation is rarely driven by ignorance. It's calculated, repeated, polished. They know what they're doing. They just never expected you to see it. So when you do, don't waste time trying to guide them. Don't waste words on clarity they'll never honor. That lesson you want to teach? Let life handle it. Let consequence handle it. Let the absence of your energy, your presence, your support be the education. Because that's what truly unsettles a manipulator, not being yelled at, but being forgotten. Not being corrected, but being removed from access. You become a blank space, no longer triggered, no longer influenced. You become unreadable. And to someone who relies on emotional buttons, that's terrifying. They don't know how to navigate still waters. They need drama to function, validation to thrive, attention to survive. Take that away, and their structure collapses. Slowly, quietly, completely. And here's the truth. When you outgrow someone, it's not your job to announce it. Growth is silent. It happens in private, in the small moments where you choose your peace over their patterns, where you choose boundaries over explanations. You don't slam the door, you simply stop answering it. And over time they realize something's different. You're no longer emotionally available, no longer tangled in their games, no longer giving them the reaction they need to feel powerful. And that change, it shakes them, not immediately, but eventually. There's a quiet dignity in not proving your point, in walking away with calm instead of chaos, in allowing your evolution to be your response. You're not responsible for making them see it. You're responsible for protecting your mind, for preserving your clarity, for keeping your energy from being drained by someone who never planned to change. That's what Stoicism teaches, not to suppress your emotions, but to master them, not to disconnect from truth, but to stop forcing it onto people who aren't ready to receive it. And the best part? You don't have to carry bitterness. You don't have to seek revenge. You don't have to stay stuck in the past, reliving every conversation, every manipulation. You can release it all, not because they deserve peace, but because you do. You can choose to let go, not with resentment, but with resolve. Because freedom doesn't always come from a fight. Sometimes it comes from the simple decision to stop trying to be understood by someone who made confusion their weapon. You won't find your strength by confronting every manipulator. You'll find it by staying rooted when they try to shake you, by standing still when they try to provoke, by choosing clarity over chaos. And when they realize that you're no longer teachable, not because you lack knowledge, but because you've transcended the lesson, they'll have nothing left to grip, nothing left to manipulate, nothing left to anchor their tactics to. You've grown past the need to teach them, and that in itself is the most powerful lesson of all, because you didn't lower yourself to expose them. You didn't sacrifice your peace to prove a point. You stayed composed, moved in silence, let them wonder, let them sit with the void you left behind. And maybe they'll change, maybe they won't, but by then it won't matter, because you'll have already moved on, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. You didn't just walk away, you evolved, and that's the kind of transformation no manipulator can follow. Growth doesn't roar. It doesn't demand to be seen. It simply leaves, quietly, completely. And when you choose peace over power plays, you don't just escape manipulation, you reclaim yourself. If this message spoke to something deep within you, watch the next video on the screen. It was made for minds like yours. And thank you truly for being a part of Stoic Journal.